Hello, government students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 2, Section 4, talking about the Constitutional Convention. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the people and groups that influenced this Constitutional Convention, along with the different plans that were introduced to help bring about the passage of the Constitution. So we're going to start with some of our founders. George Washington happened to preside over the meetings. He was our first president, not necessarily a president in the likes of what we're going to see, but he is going to be the man who's going to hold the gavel during this convention. Eventually, he's going to become our president. But Ben Franklin was our oldest delegate. He played an active role in the debates. Governor Morris, a delegate as well, wrote the final draft of the Constitution, including all the different compromises that were included. We have James Madison, who is kind of the architect, the father of the Constitution. He authored the basic plan, and then when it was up for debate, it had some revisions. Uh, William Patterson, he was the leader of the small states, and he was a man who offered up what is called the New Jersey Plan. Roger Sherman helped draft what is known as the Connecticut Compromise, which is going to look very familiar because some of the things that come out of that are basically the things that we see currently within the document. We also have our groups. We have our Federalists. These are some of our delegates who favored writing up a brand new form of government, the Constitution. The goal here was that they wanted a strong national government, whereas our anti-Federalists, they opposed the Constitution because they feared a strong national government. And we're going to take a look at some of the different individuals that would have fallen in either one of those camps. Alexander Hamilton happened to be a Federalist. He did author some of the Federalist Papers. These were articles that were written up and published that were in support of the Constitution, along with John Jay, who also authored some of these different Federalist Papers, which, by the way, the Federalist Papers were a collection of over 80 essays that were in support of the Constitution. So let's take a look at these Federalist and Anti-Federalist. We mentioned Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, but James Madison, obviously being the architect of this document, was in that Federalist camp. But some of our Anti-Federalists, people who were concerned about having a strong central government, were some really well-known men like Thomas Jefferson, Samuel Adams, Richard Henry Lee, who was the father of Robert E. Lee, and Patrick Henry, the man who was known for the little speech that he gave back in the time of the War of Independence, give me liberty or give me death. All of these people had their reasons to be a little concerned about maybe handing over far more power to a national government. So let's talk about what the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist stood for. The Federalists obviously stood for ratification of the Constitution. They wanted it passed. They did favor a strong, powerful federal government or a national government. And part of that was because of all the weaknesses that were uncovered as a result of the Articles of Confederation. But the one thing that we need to remember here is that our Federalists thought that the Constitution alone was perfect. They didn't think that they needed a Bill of Rights. They didn't think that it was needed because the federal government was already limited, and thus it would be a waste of time to debate that. Whereas our anti-federalists were kind of the opposite. They opposed ratification of the Constitution. They figured that strong federal government would be dangerous. So if they had a weaker federal government, it wouldn't threaten states and their rights. And finally, when it came time to debating the issue about a Bill of Rights, anti-federalists were the ones who introduced this idea. They thought that individuals had certain rights that needed to be protected from that of the national government. And hence, they insisted that if they wanted to pass or ratify the Constitution, they needed to include a set of rights. And these would become known as the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to our Constitution. So, needless to say, there obviously were some harsh words exchanged between our Federalists and Anti-Federalists. As a matter of fact, This really comes down to kind of laying out the lines for our first political parties that we're going to see in the United States. But within the debates, there's going to be some different proposals. We have the Virginia plan, sometimes known as the large state plan. The features of this would be three branches of government, unlike our old Articles of Confederation, which was a one branch government, just a legislative branch. This is going to be bicameral, meaning that we're going to have two houses. We're going to have a lower house that's going to be elected by the people, and then an upper house, which would be selected by members of the lower house. Uh, this way, you have kind of like that model that you would have seen in Great Britain with like the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Some of our states had already implemented something like this. Congress would have the ability to choose their executive branch, and then the executive and judicial branches could veto acts of Congress, meaning that they could override what Congress did as far as passing of laws. And it would be a lot easier to amend or change than old Articles of Confederation. All right. We mentioned a moment ago William Patterson, the fact that he introduced the small state plan for the state of New Jersey. This again would feature three branches of government, but it would be a situation very similar to that of the Articles. Your legislative branch would be a unicameral, one house. Each state would get one vote, just like under the Articles. And, as you're reading this, I want you to think about this. Think of all the problems that we had with the Articles. We're kind of lining it up again to have more problems. The executive branch would consist of more than one person. It would be like a panel of people. And then finally, the judicial branch would be chosen by Congress. There might be a conflict of interest here. And certainly this was a concern for some of the different delegates. And thus, we're going to have to figure out a way that we can get both the large and the small state plans incorporated. So we're going to have a series of compromises. We have our Connecticut Compromise. A Connecticut Compromise, for the most part, would modify the Virginia plan for providing a legislative branch with the House of Representatives based on population, and the Senate, which again would be made up of basically voters. The voters from the House would vote for the Senate, but there would be two representatives from each state. The Senate would be the upper house, and the House of Representatives would be the lower house. There were also a couple of other compromises that were a way to kind of appease people when you talk about how you're going to choose the House of Representatives. House is going to be based on population. And so the issue of slavery is going to come up. How do you count enslaved people? These are individuals who really, in the scope of the law, didn't have a lot of rights. And yet, there are people that are going to want to count them as part of the population when it comes to having representation within the House. So there were a couple different compromises. We have our three-fifths compromise, which was to solve the issue about how to count the slave population. When we're doing a census, we're counting up our population. How do you count the slaves in the South or slaves in general? And it was determined that slaves would count as three-fifths of a person in determining representation in the House of Representatives. What's interesting is you might think that this was a compromise that was proposed by Southerners. The truth is, this is actually a compromise that came from the Northern delegates, meaning that they didn't want to count slaves as a full person. But yet at the same time, they knew that they needed to do something there to kind of, appease to the South, and hence three-fifths is kind of the number that they come up with. There is also the Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise. And basically, it was determined by the delegates not to ban slavery or the slave trade, not slavery in general, but the slave trade, into the year 1808. Um, Up until 1808, you could bring slaves in from elsewhere. But after 1808, slavery, importation of slaves would be banned. And hence, it didn't necessarily end slavery, but it did end the practice of bringing in slaves from the Caribbean or Africa. Also, this would help with commerce business, where no port taxes would be levied with the hope of sparking trade and maybe getting the economy kind of back on a firm standing. All right, all of these sound great. To ratify the Constitution, we're going to have to do a few things. One, this document's going to be basically sent to the states, and that happened in September of 1787. To get it passed, we need 9 states to ratify it. That happened in 1788. A couple of the states didn't approve this. New York and Virginia didn't approve it at all because they felt like they were going to have to sacrifice too much due to their size. And needless to say, the 9 out of the 13 did pass. Thank you very much.